The alarm in my chamber woke me before the light cycle began, and that alone told me something had gone wrong. I am Valor Kesh, senior delegate of the Threni Convergence, and in 40 years of service to the Galactic Council, I had never been summoned before dawn. I pulled on my formal sash and rushed through the marble corridors of the Council Spire, past murals celebrating 1,000 years of supposed unity, and into the main chamber where every delegate was already seated, whispering. The human seat was empty, not vacated in protest, not overturned in anger. Simply empty, the chair pushed in neatly, as if no one had ever sat there at all. I took my place beside the delegate from Corvain, a tall insectoid diplomat named Trask, who leaned toward me and murmured that the humans had requested no further correspondence effective immediately. I laughed, quietly, because it sounded like a joke. Humans did not walk away from anything. They argued, they petitioned, they filed grievances that stretched for cycles. They did not vanish overnight. I did not yet understand how wrong I was. To explain what happened, I have to go back 3 days, to the vote that I now believe broke something no one saw breaking. The Council had gathered to decide on the Trade Autonomy Amendment, a measure that would strip member species below a certain population threshold of the right to negotiate their own resource contracts. Officially, it was framed as a stabilization policy, meant to protect smaller species from predatory trade practices. Unofficially, everyone in that chamber knew exactly what it meant. Humanity, despite 30 years of contribution to the Council, despite rebuilding 3 shattered colonies during the Verax famine, despite lending their engineers to reinforce failing orbital rings across a dozen systems, had never been granted full member status. They were permanent observers, guests with responsibilities but no real voice. The amendment would have made that permanent. I remember watching Ambassador Daniel Hartley as the votes were read aloud. He did not flinch. He did not look surprised. He sat with his hands folded on the table, the same posture he always held, patient and still, while delegate after delegate voted in favor of the amendment. 72 in favor, 11 against. Humanity's own vote did not even count toward the total, since observers held no binding vote, only the right to speak. When the final tally was read, the council speaker, a broad-shouldered Andrai elder named Sarek Voss, turned to Hartley and asked, almost as a formality, whether the human delegation wished to make any final statement before the amendment was ratified. Hartley stood. I expected fury. I expected the kind of impassioned speech humans were known for, full of appeals to history and sacrifice and fairness. Instead, he looked around the chamber slowly, meeting the eyes of delegates who had voted against his people, and he said only this. Understood. We will see ourselves out. Then he sat back down. The chamber murmured, uncertain what he meant. Voss asked for clarification, and Hartley simply repeated that humanity would be withdrawing from active council participation, effective at the end of the current session. No threats, no demands, no conditions for return. He thanked the council for the opportunity to serve, gathered the small stack of files in front of him, and walked out of the chamber without another word. I remember turning to Trask and saying that it was theater, nothing more. Humans were proud, emotional, prone to dramatic gestures. They would return within a cycle, humbled and asking for reinstatement, the way every species eventually did after a failed protest. I had seen it before with the Kaloon Assembly, with the Rendari Compact, with a dozen smaller worlds who threatened to leave and always came crawling back once they realized how much they depended on council infrastructure. I was certain humans would be no different. 3 days later, their seat sat empty, and no message had come. I did not think much of it at first. I had duties of my own, trade disputes to mediate, a border dispute between 2 mining consortiums that required my attention. It was not until the end of that week, during a routine systems briefing, that the first crack appeared. The Council's communication relay network, the vast web of signal boosters that allowed instant contact between member systems, began reporting delays. Not failures, not yet, just delays, a few seconds here and there, messages arriving slightly out of order. The technicians assured everyone it was a minor calibration issue, nothing to worry about, and I believed them, because why would I not? What none of us fully understood, not then, was that the relay network's core maintenance division had been staffed almost entirely by human engineers for the past decade. Not because humans held any official authority over it, but because they were simply good at it, and other species had grown comfortable letting them handle the tedious, unglamorous work of keeping the signals clean. It was the kind of arrangement no one had ever written into a treaty, because it had simply happened, quietly, the way so many things involving humans had simply happened over the years. I remember a conversation I had with Hartley months before all of this, at a reception following a trade summit. I had asked him, half joking, why his people worked so hard maintaining systems that were not officially theirs to maintain. He had smiled, the way humans do when they are being polite about something that troubles them, and said that his people had learned a long time ago that being useful was the only leverage they had, since no one had ever given them a seat at the table simply because it was right to do so. I had nodded along without truly hearing him. I heard him now, 3 days after his departure, as I sat in the briefing room listening to reports of communication delays that no one could yet explain. The council speaker called an informal gathering that evening, not a full session, just senior delegates discussing the human withdrawal in hushed tones over untouched refreshments. Trask believed it was nothing more than wounded pride and predicted a formal request for reinstatement within a month. A delegate from the Voth cluster suggested sending an envoy to smooth things over, an offer of partial concessions to bring humanity back into the fold without technically reversing the amendment. Voss dismissed the idea, insisting that humanity needed the council far more than the council needed them, and that patience would resolve the matter on its own. I said very little that evening. Something about Hartley's calm, about the total absence of anger in his voice, sat wrong with me. Humans argued when they were hurt. They protested when they were wronged. They did not simply walk away in silence unless they had already decided the argument was over before it began. I raised this concern once, carefully, to Voss, who waved it away with the confidence of someone who had outlasted 100 political storms. He told me that every species eventually learned its place in the galactic order, and that humanity, for all its usefulness, was no exception. He reminded me that they held no formal power, no council seat, no binding vote. Whatever discomfort their absence caused would be temporary, a brief adjustment period before things returned to normal. I wanted to believe him. It would have been easier to believe him. Instead, I found myself thinking about the small things Hartley had mentioned over the years, offhand comments I had never taken seriously. He once mentioned that human engineers had quietly patched failing life support systems on an on-dry research station after the official contractor missed 3 consecutive deadlines. He mentioned that human medical teams had developed treatment protocols for a plague on a Corvain colony that the Council's own medical division had failed to contain for 2 years. He mentioned these things not as complaints, but as simple facts, the way someone describes their job when asked what they do for a living. I had never asked myself what would happen if all of that quiet, unofficial work simply stopped. I was about to find out. That night, walking back to my quarters through the same marble corridors I had rushed through that morning, I passed the Human Embassy Wing, a modest set of offices near the edge of the council spire. The lights were off. The doors were sealed, not with force, but with the simple finality of a place that had been closed and would not be reopening soon. A single plaque remained beside the entrance, engraved with the words that had always marked their office, a phrase they had chosen themselves when they first joined as observers decades ago. "We came to help." I stood there longer than I should have, staring at those 4 words, feeling a cold unease settle into my chest that I could not yet explain, but would understand fully in the weeks to come. Something had ended that day in the chamber, something far larger than a single vote or a single amendment, and none of us, not Voss, not Trask, not even I, had any idea how much we had been leaning on the quiet strength of a people we had never bothered to truly see. I did not sleep well that night. I kept hearing Hartley's voice, calm and final, echoing through the empty chamber. "We will see ourselves out." I did not yet know how completely that sentence would come to define everything that followed. The days after the closing of the Human Embassy passed in a strange quiet. the kind of quiet that feels heavier than noise. I kept expecting some announcement, some official word from Earth explaining what had truly happened, but nothing came. No transmissions, no diplomatic notes, no request for clarification on the terms of withdrawal. It was as though an entire species had simply stepped behind a curtain and pulled it closed without a sound. I threw myself into my usual duties, hoping the routine would settle the unease in my chest, but the routine itself began to unravel in small, strange ways. The mining dispute I had been mediating between two Corvain consortiums stalled when the shared logistics platform they used to track resource shipments began returning errors. It was a minor system, nothing anyone considered important, built years ago by a joint engineering team that had long since moved on to other projects. I later learned that the two human engineers who had quietly kept that platform running through informal patches, long after the official maintenance contract expired, had been part of the general withdrawal. No one had noticed they were doing it until they stopped. I mentioned this to Trask over a shared meal, expecting him to dismiss it the way he dismissed most things that unsettled him. Instead, he grew quiet, his mandibles clicking together in the way they did when he was thinking hard about something he did not want to say aloud. He told me that a similar issue had struck the orbital repair yard above his homeworld, where a rotation of human technicians had been quietly training local crews for the better part of a decade. The training program had ended without warning, and the yard supervisor had only just discovered that several critical repair procedures existed nowhere in official documentation, because the humans who performed them had simply known how through years of practiced instinct and had never been asked to write any of it down. It was a small thing, in isolation, a training program ending, a logistics platform returning errors. But small things, I was beginning to understand, had a way of connecting to other small things, forming a pattern that no single delegate could see until they stepped back far enough to view the whole shape of it. I began stepping back. I requested access to the Council's infrastructure oversight reports, the dry administrative documents that tracked which systems were maintained by which member species. It took considerable effort, since such reports were rarely requested by anyone outside the technical division, and the clerks who managed them seemed almost surprised that a senior delegate would want to see them at all. When the reports finally arrived, I spent 3 full days reading through them, cross-referencing names and departments, tracing the quiet threads of human involvement that ran through nearly every corner of Council operations. What I found unsettled me more than anything Hartley had said in that chamber. Human personnel, despite representing a small fraction of the Council's total workforce, had been responsible for maintaining a disproportionate share of what the reports called critical support functions: communication relay calibration, emergency medical protocol development, orbital debris tracking, water reclamation system design for 3 separate colony worlds. None of these responsibilities had ever been formally assigned to humanity through treaty or mandate. They had simply accumulated, task by task, favor by favor, over decades of humans quietly volunteering for the unglamorous work that other species preferred to avoid. I found a note buried in an old administrative memo, written nearly 15 years earlier, in which a Council technical officer had recommended formally compensating human engineering teams for their disproportionate contribution to shared infrastructure. The recommendation had been reviewed and quietly shelved, on the grounds that formal compensation might be interpreted as a step toward granting humanity greater status within the Council, a step the majority of member species were not yet willing to take. I sat with that memo for a long while, feeling something cold settle in my stomach. We had taken everything humanity offered, and offered nothing in return except permission to keep offering. I brought my findings to Voss, hoping to convince him that the situation was more serious than anyone in the Council leadership wanted to admit. He listened, to his credit, though I could see in his expression that he was humoring me more than truly considering my concerns. When I finished, he asked a single question. He asked whether any of these systems had actually failed yet, or whether I was simply describing a theoretical risk based on old paperwork. I had to admit that nothing had failed outright. Not yet. Voss took this as confirmation that his patient strategy was working. He reminded me, not unkindly, that species with wounded pride often overstated the consequences of their absence, as a way of convincing themselves their departure mattered more than it truly did. He suggested I was allowing sentiment to cloud my judgment, perhaps influenced by whatever personal friendship I had formed with Ambassador Hartley over the years. I did not argue further, though the accusation stung more than I expected. It was not sentiment driving my concern. It was the growing certainty that the Council had built its foundation on a support structure it never acknowledged, and that structure had just quietly walked away. 2 weeks after the withdrawal, the first genuine emergency arrived, though at the time, none of us recognized it as the beginning of something far larger. A relay failure struck the communication network connecting the outer trade routes, the long corridor of systems that handled nearly 40% of the Council's interstellar commerce. What should have been a minor, easily corrected fault instead cascaded through 3 connected stations before technicians managed to isolate it, cutting off communication with an entire cluster of mining colonies for nearly 2 full days. During those 2 days, cargo ships scheduled to dock at those colonies had no updated arrival data, and 2 vessels nearly collided in a crowded approach corridor after their automated traffic systems lost synchronization with the relay network. No one was harmed, thankfully, but the near collision sent a ripple of alarm through the Council's technical division. An emergency review was called, and I attended, though I was not required to. The engineers who presented their findings were clearly exhausted, having worked through both days of the outage trying to understand a system that, as it turned out, none of them fully understood on their own. The chief technical officer, a soft-spoken Voth engineer named Erin Castell, admitted something that silenced the room. She admitted that the relay network's core calibration protocol, the very software that kept the entire communication grid synchronized, had been designed and refined almost entirely by a small team of human specialists over the past 12 years. The current technical staff had access to the system, could operate it under normal conditions, but had never been trained to diagnose or repair it when it failed in unusual ways, because it had simply never failed in unusual ways before, not while the original designers were still quietly managing it behind the scenes. The team that had built and maintained the very backbone of Council communication across a dozen star systems had been part of the human delegation, and every one of them had returned to Earth without a word of protest, without so much as a formal handover of documentation, because no one had ever asked them to prepare one. I watched the color drain from several delegates' faces as Castell finished her report. I did not feel satisfaction at being right. I felt only a deep, growing dread, because if a system this important had been so quietly dependent on a handful of departed engineers, I could only imagine how many other systems shared the same hidden fragility. Over the following days, the reports multiplied. A medical research station studying a resistant strain of fever that had plagued 3 colony worlds reported that its lead epidemiological consultant, a human researcher who had been quietly guiding the project for years without any official leadership title, had ceased all contact. The station's remaining staff discovered that critical portions of the treatment protocol existed only in the consultant's personal notes that had never been formally submitted to the Council's medical archive because no one had ever required it. A water reclamation facility on a desert colony reported unexplained inefficiencies in its purification cycle, inefficiencies that had apparently been silently corrected for years by a human maintenance engineer who adjusted the system manually each week, a task so routine that the facility's official logs never even mentioned it as a distinct responsibility. Each report, on its own, seemed small, explainable, a minor inconvenience rather than a crisis. But I had read the infrastructure reports. I had traced the quiet threads. I understood now that these were not isolated incidents. They were the first visible cracks in a foundation that had been quietly reinforced by human hands for decades, hands that had just been withdrawn all at once, without warning, without protest, and without any apparent intention of returning. I requested an audience with Voss again, this time formally, insisting that the Council needed to acknowledge the scale of what was happening before it grew any worse. He agreed to hear me, though I sensed his patience thinning, not with the crisis itself, but with my persistence in raising it. I laid out everything I had found, the infrastructure reports, the shelved compensation memo, the relay failure, the medical protocol gap, the water reclamation issue. I told him plainly that humanity had not merely withdrawn from political participation, they had withdrawn the invisible labor that held countless council systems together. Labor no one had ever formally recognized, because recognizing it would have meant admitting how much the council owed to a species it refused to grant equal status. Voss listened, his expression unreadable, and when I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he said something I would remember for the rest of my life. He said that even if everything I described was true, the Council could not simply reverse the amendment to appease a single withdrawn species, because doing so would set a precedent that any member could hold the entire Council hostage through the threat of their own absence. I asked him what he believed the alternative was. He said the Council would adapt. It always had. Other species would step forward to fill the gaps humanity left behind, and within a cycle or two, the disruption would fade into memory, another difficult chapter in the long history of galactic cooperation. I left that meeting with a growing certainty that Voss, and perhaps the majority of the Council leadership, fundamentally misunderstood what had happened. This was not a labor shortage that could be solved by reassigning personnel. It was the sudden absence of decades of quiet expertise, built through years of trust and practiced skill that could not simply be replicated by species who had never been asked or trained or trusted to do that work themselves. I did not know yet how right I was to be afraid, nor how much worse the situation would become in the weeks that followed, as the small cracks I had traced through old reports began to widen into fractures that no emergency session could quietly contain. The fracture that finally forced the Council to admit the scale of the crisis began on a colony called Marrow Station, a mid-sized agricultural world in the outer trade cluster that supplied grain and processed nutrients to nearly 6 other systems. I had visited Marrow Station once, years earlier, during a routine diplomatic tour, and I remembered it as a place of quiet, orderly efficiency, its automated farming grids stretching to the horizon under a pale green sky. The colony's automated distribution network, the system responsible for tracking harvest yields and coordinating shipments to dependent systems, began reporting inconsistent data 3 weeks after the human withdrawal. At first, the colony administrators assumed it was a simple software glitch, the kind that could be patched with a routine update. They requested assistance from the Council's Agricultural Oversight Division, only to discover that the original architects of Marrow Station's distribution network, a small team of human agricultural engineers, had left the colony entirely during the general withdrawal, taking with them the deep, practical understanding of a system they had built and refined for nearly 2 decades. The colony administrators, none of whom had ever needed to understand the network at that level of detail, attempted their own repairs. Their efforts made the problem worse. Shipments meant for one system were misrouted to another, while systems expecting resupply received nothing at all. By the time the Council's Emergency Response Division became involved, 3 dependent colonies had gone nearly a full cycle without their expected nutrient shipments, and food reserves on those worlds had fallen to levels that colony administrators described, with obvious alarm, as concerning. I attended the emergency session convened to address the Marrow Station crisis, and for the first time since the withdrawal began, I saw genuine panic in the chamber. Delegates who had spent weeks dismissing my concerns as exaggeration now demanded immediate answers. How quickly could the distribution network be repaired? How soon could shipments resume? Whether the Council possessed any personnel capable of understanding a system built entirely by departed human engineers. The answers, when they came, were not reassuring. Ian Castell, still leading the technical division's response, explained that repairing the network without the original architects would require reverse engineering years of accumulated modifications, a process her team estimated could take several months, far longer than the affected colonies could safely wait without intervention. She recommended an emergency measure, redirecting shipments from unaffected systems to cover the shortfall, a solution that would stretch resources across the entire trade cluster but prevent immediate hardship on the worst affected worlds. The Council approved the measure, and for a brief period, it seemed the crisis might be contained through sheer administrative effort. I remember feeling a flicker of relief, a hope that perhaps Voss had been right after all, that the Council could adapt its way through this disruption without truly reckoning with what had been lost. That relief did not last. The redirected shipments strained transport schedules across the outer cluster, exposing yet another quiet dependency none of us had recognized. The traffic coordination system, managing docking schedules for cargo vessels across the cluster, had, like the relay network before it, been substantially refined by human logistics specialists over the years. Specialists who understood its quirks and limitations in ways the current staff did not. As shipment volumes increased to cover the Marrow Station shortfall, the coordination system began struggling to manage the additional traffic, producing scheduling conflicts that led to delays across nearly every major shipping lane in the cluster. I watched, with a growing sense of helplessness, as one strained system revealed the fragility of another, each failure compounding the last, like a structure losing support beams one at a time until the entire frame began to lean. During this period, I received an unexpected message, not from the council, but from an old contact, a human logistics coordinator named Grace Whitmore, who had worked alongside council staff for nearly a decade before the withdrawal. I had known her casually through shared committee work, and though I had not expected any human to break the silence that had followed Hartley's departure, her message arrived quietly, without fanfare, addressed to me personally rather than to the council as a body. She wrote that she had heard, through channels she did not specify, about the difficulties at Marrow Station, and that she wanted to offer a small piece of advice, not as an official act of assistance, but simply as one professional acknowledging another's struggle. She explained, briefly and without elaboration, that the distribution network's core scheduling algorithm contained a fail-safe protocol that the original team had built in years earlier, a protocol that could stabilize shipment routing automatically if activated correctly, but which had never been documented because it had never needed to be used while the original team was present to monitor the system directly. She included the activation sequence, a short string of technical instructions, and closed her message by wishing me well, with no further explanation and no indication of when or whether she might be willing to help again. I brought the message to Castell immediately, and within hours her team confirmed that the fail-safe protocol existed exactly as Whitmore had described. Activating it stabilized the distribution network almost immediately, resolving the misrouting errors that had plagued Marrow Station for nearly 2 weeks. The relief in the technical division was immediate and profound, but it was tempered, for me at least, by an uncomfortable realization. We had been saved by a single act of quiet generosity from someone who owed the council nothing at all. I raised this point during the following council session, arguing that Whitmore's assistance, however small, proved something important. Humanity had not left out of vindictiveness, determined to watch the council suffer. Individual humans clearly still felt some connection to the people and systems they had helped build, even after their government's formal withdrawal. If the council approached this situation with humility, rather than entitlement, perhaps there remained a path toward genuine reconciliation, one built on equal footing rather than the quiet exploitation that had defined the relationship for decades. Several delegates seemed moved by this argument, but Voss remained unconvinced. He pointed out that a single unofficial message from a single individual was not a policy, and that the council could not build its recovery strategy around the hope that scattered humans might occasionally take pity on their former colleagues. He insisted that the council needed a formal, structural solution, one that did not depend on the goodwill of a species that had already demonstrated its willingness to walk away without warning. I asked him what structural solution he had in mind. His answer troubled me deeply. He proposed a new initiative, one that would offer significant incentives, expanded trade privileges, technological resources, even limited voting rights, to any individual humans willing to return to council service as private contractors, entirely separate from any formal negotiation with Earth's government. In effect, he wanted to lure away the very people who had chosen to leave, offering them personally what the council had refused to offer their species collectively, all while continuing to deny humanity any genuine standing within the council itself. I told him plainly that I believed this approach was not only unlikely to succeed, but deeply dishonorable, an attempt to exploit human generosity without ever acknowledging the debt it represented. Voss dismissed my objection as naive, arguing that the council's survival mattered more than abstract questions of honor, and that if individual humans were foolish enough to accept such an offer, the council would be foolish not to make it. The initiative was approved over my objection, and outreach began within days. Quiet, informal messages sent to known human contacts across the council's various divisions, offering generous terms for a return to unofficial service. I watched the results with a mixture of dread and reluctant curiosity, uncertain whether Voss's cynical strategy might actually succeed, given how thoroughly humanity's usefulness had been proven over the preceding weeks. The results, when they came, were unambiguous. Not a single human responded. Whitmore herself, the very